Hi, I'm Eliot, the IELTS expert at Magoosh, and I've been helping English language learners for 15 years to study for the IELTS and to improve their English skills. So we're going to focus on IELTS Writing Task 1 prompts with line graphs. We're going to look at some tips on how to approach these questions, and we'll look at a sample essay prompt, thinking about how to apply those tips. So let's take a look. Okay, now here's an example of a Task 1 prompt that has line graphs. Now remember, on any Task 1 prompt, you might get a mixture of different types of visuals. In this case, we have two line graphs. They're very closely related to each other, but you could have a line graph and a table or a pie chart or any number of different combinations there. Since we're focusing on line graphs in this lesson, we're just going to take a look at these sample visuals and think about how to respond to them in your Task 1 prompts. Okay, so let's take a quick look first at our sample question here. We're going to go over some tips about line graphs and how to respond to them, and then we will look at a sample response to this question at the end of this video. All right, so first, just going over what the question says. Here we have the summary at the top. The charts below give information about average commuters and vehicles on the road per hour in Winston City, a large North American metropolitan area. Okay, then we have to summarize the information, selecting and reporting the main features and making comparisons where relevant. That's the information you always have to consider for every Task 1 prompt. And we have our visuals down below. On the left here, we're looking at commuters, and on the right, we're looking at vehicles, okay? And these are the vehicles listed. These are the types of commuters, and we see information about commute times, hours of the day listed below there. Okay, so the question is, how do we approach questions like these with line graphs, and what are some specific tips you can use to answer these questions well? Okay, let's take a look. So, as with any Task 1 prompt, your first job is to take the information you see in the visual and figure out how you can describe it accurately, okay, and in your own words, right, and efficiently. So, not just listing information in your response, but consolidating and organizing the information in a coherent way. That's what will give you the best score on Task 1. So that means for prompts with line graphs, your first job is going to be to identify all of the variables and all of the different features of the line graph and to be able to describe them accurately. So in a moment, we'll take a look at these sample line graphs again, and we'll work together to identify all of the variables, all the information that we need to report about on them. Okay, second tip here, very similar to almost every other kind of Task 1 prompt, you need to find shared or related variables. This is what helps you to answer the question efficiently because you consolidate information wherever possible and you find ways to take all the information in your visuals and organize it in a logical way. Finding shared and related variables is the key step in allowing you to be able to describe things efficiently in most cases. Okay, so again, we're going to take a look in a moment at how to do that in our sample line graphs. Finally, we need to paraphrase. Again, very similar to all other Task 1 prompts, you need to be able to take information on your line graph and you need to paraphrase it accurately and in your own words, right? Okay, that's what paraphrasing is, taking something you see in these visuals and describing them whenever possible in your own language. Okay, so again, let's take a look at how to do that here with our sample line graphs. First of all, identifying all the variables. First, let's go to the graph titles because they provide a summary of the information that we see down below. Okay, so in the first graph, we're looking at average commuters on the road in Winston City. Okay, so these are commuters, people, right? So we're looking at the number of people in this case. That's different from the second graph because in the second graph, we're not thinking about people at all. We're thinking about vehicles. So in order to describe these visuals accurately in your response, you need to keep these things separate. We need to keep them organized in some way so that when we're responding about the first line graph, the one on the top, we're ensuring that we're discussing types of commuters. And in the second one, we're talking about types of vehicles. That distinction will need to be very present in your response when you respond to this question. Okay? Then on chart 1, the commuters are broken down. Okay, so we've got 3 types of commuters listed. We've got carpool commuters, non-carpool commuters, and bus riders. Okay, so I guess the carpool commuters are people who share a ride to work. Okay, and we can see conveniently a nice definition of what a carpool commuter or a carpool vehicle is down below. Okay, so we assume that this information is also related to our definition of carpool commuters. It says down below, carpool vehicles are defined as vehicles containing 2 or more adults who are not in the same immediate family. Okay, so we know that carpool commuters are people who ride together to work every day, possibly school, and they are not in the same family. They're sharing a car. They're sharing a ride to get to that place. Non-carpool commuters, people who are driving, but who are not sharing a ride with somebody outside of their immediate family. And then we've got bus riders in the first line graph there. Down below, we have a similar analysis, but with the types of vehicles there. We have carpool vehicles, vehicles that are being used for the purposes of carpooling. We have non-carpool vehicles, okay? And we have buses. All right, very, very similar categories here, except, again, that we're talking about people in the one graph and vehicles in the other. Very important to keep that straight. Okay, finally then, the variables we're considering, obviously something shared here. We've got the hours of day. So starting from 6 a.m., 6 in the morning, to 9 p.m., we have the time of day listed. And so we're looking at averages on both of these line graphs. Average number of commuters, we've got them listed in the thousands here on both charts. During these particular times of day. So we see a nice progression in the line graphs moving from left to right about how much activity there is, how many commuters are on the road, how many commuting vehicles are on the road, including buses and non-carpool commuters and vehicles as well. All right, so those are all the variables we've got to consider, and we have to find a way to include a basic summary of all these variables. Somewhere towards the beginning of your response, you need to describe what the line graphs show and include all of these categories in your general description of what the visuals include. Okay, and then we want to find shared or related variables so that we can describe the information on both charts as efficiently as possible. Okay, again, the idea here is that you're going to lose points if you just list a lot of things, a lot of data, like a bunch of bullet points in your response. You want to find ways to combine information and report about things efficiently. Well, one thing that stands out to me is that both of our line graphs here organize or demonstrate, these sort of peak hours for both commuters and vehicles, right? There's a sense in which these time frames in the morning from 7 a.m. to 11 a.m. and then from about 3 p.m. to about 7 p.m., these appear to be the peak sort of rush hour times. And so there must be ways we can talk about the number of commuters and the number of vehicles on the road in a way that's shared in some way. Okay, similarly, the concept of busing. Well, in the first line graph, we've got information about bus riders, which is the sort of top category of commuters going to work using buses, to and from work using buses, right? We've got almost 27,000 people there, it looks like, who are using those systems, right? In the other chart, we've got busing as the lowest category of activity, right? There are very few buses on the road. So if we're talking about busing, there's an interesting contrast there that we might want to report about, that busing involves the most people, but the fewest number of vehicles. Okay, and that's logically makes sense, but that's the pattern we see here in this data. And if we could describe it efficiently by pulling those two pieces of information together into one sentence, that kind of thing is going to help our response. Okay, you'll see an example of that in our sample essay towards the end of this lesson. Paraphrasing key terms. Well, let's just take a look at our sample line graphs here and think through what could we paraphrase from these two visuals here. Okay, well, as you probably know, the nouns carpool and bus can both be used as verbs. So we could do some paraphrasing that way, where we change around the grammatical usage of the words on the charts and use them as verbs, right? Similarly, commute and commuting are other forms of the noun commuters that's used in the graph heading there. Okay, so that would be an easy thing to switch around to use a different grammatical form of those words and show off your grammatical range in your response. Okay, we could also talk about drivers, passengers, personal vehicles, public transportation, lots of different words we could use to replace some of the terms used on the graphs themselves. Okay, whenever you can and you know you can do it accurately, you should be using different terms to show off your vocabulary on your task 1 response. All right, but we still haven't analyzed our line graphs yet. So the question is, what do we need to know in order to identify the key data, the significant data that we should pull out from our line graphs and report about in our response? Okay, well, the kind of information you'll select most often from line graphs will have patterns like these. There will often be extremes, okay, so highs and lows or even flat lines indicating very little change compared to other variables that you see on the line graph. You can also look for the overall pattern in the data. Okay, so look at it generally. The line graphs are very useful for showing changes over time in most cases. Okay, so you can look for what is the overall pattern created by the data and try to describe that. Again, we'll look at this closely with our sample question in a moment, because as you probably remember, there are some major sort of fluctuations, some peaks that occur for 2 of the categories and a flat line as a general trend for the busing category, right? So as you look at the data, what is the overall picture it presents from beginning to end? That is a useful thing to report about in your response. Okay, finally then, you want to look for sharp contrasts. So do some of the variables diverge significantly or show very different patterns? That's excellent data to pull out and describe in your response. Remember, your job isn't to interpret these patterns. You simply need to identify and report about them. So look for those major contrasts in the data and pull those out and report about them in your response. All right, so let's apply these concepts to the sample essay question we're looking at and really look closely at how to apply these concepts and put them to use in a sample response. All right, so we're going to begin with paragraph 1. Okay, and remember, paragraph 1 is going to be a summary paragraph where we're trying to describe the contents of the line graphs, the contents of the visuals for our task 1 prompt in a way that paraphrases usually the language that they give you in the question itself and maybe the titles of the line graphs you're looking at. You want to simply provide a very broad overview of what information is contained in the visuals you're looking at. So let's look at our paragraph 1 sample down here. The line graphs show the number of commuters and number of vehicles on the road per hour in Winston City, organized by commuter type. Okay. The commuter and vehicle types represented in the chart are carpool, non-carpool, and bus. Okay, so again, consolidating things. The computer and vehicle types are, and then we consolidate that information into one set of definitions, right? There are carpool commuters and vehicles, non-carpool commuters and vehicles, and a busing category. All right, so pulling it all together and describing the line graphs efficiently as we suggested at the beginning of this lesson. Let's look at paragraph 2. All right, so now we're going to just simply provide an overview of the key trends, the key things that stands out as the major patterns we notice in the line graphs. And so we can say this. Both of the visuals show a spike in the morning between 7 and 10 a.m., as well as in the evening hours between 3 and 7 p.m. All right, a major trend in both of these that's shared. we've got this sort of rush hour, these high commuting hours. And on both charts here, we see these spikes, both in the number of commuters, the people who are commuting, and the number of vehicles on the road during this same basic time frame here. All right, so a major trend we certainly would want to describe generally in our overview of these two line graphs. All right, but continuing, now we need to add more detail to this. So we need to think through what other information could we report about to provide details about what we've just discussed. Well, it says, the graph shows some major differences between the numbers of commuting persons and vehicles. The first graph shows that most commuters ride the bus. However, the number of buses changes little and is always relatively low in the second graph. For example, at the peak time of 8 a.m., there are an average of 28,000 bus commuters on around just 450 buses. Okay, so a major contrast we're pulling out. We've got all of these bus riders, but very few buses. And that's the nature of public transportation. Of course, we've got these large buses that can take lots and lots of folks. But even though the number of buses on the road stays basically the same, we see these giant increases in the number of riders at the particular peak times during the day, the morning and the afternoon when people are going to work. Okay, the last paragraph then shows a kind of opposite trend. It says, conversely, the second graph shows that while non-carpool vehicles represent the greatest number of vehicles on the road, the peak time for non-carpool vehicles is a little before 9 a.m., when there are almost 4,000 non-carpool vehicles on the road and only 14,000 non-carpool commuters. Okay, so presenting a contrast then. Notice the ways we've organized the major contrast, the data that has the sharpest contrast in the two graphs. In paragraph 3, we looked at buses and how there are so many bus riders compared to the number of buses on the road, and then conversely, a kind of opposite relationship to that in paragraph 4, talking about non-carpool vehicles and non-carpool commuters. All right, so we've looked at how to apply these tips in our sample response to our line graph visuals we have for task 1. The final piece of advice, something I always like to say to my students, is to make sure that in order to respond to these line graphs well, you're studying vocabulary. Okay, and we have a link for you down below this lesson. If you go there, it will take you to a page that includes some vocabulary resources for task 1 responses at the top of the page. And then if you look down below, there's a link to another sample task 1 prompt with line graphs for you to look at. You can apply some of the things we discussed in this video to your own response. And then you can see a sample response as well to compare to your own. Okay, so before we finish this lesson out, I'm going to put the full essay here from this lesson on the screen. I'll leave it up there a little bit. You could pause your video and read it over if you want to see the whole thing. And then we'll finish out the video after that. All right, I hope you liked the video. If you want more IELTS writing tips and strategies, check out these videos on the left, and I'll see you in the next lesson.